Okay, day 7 here. That's not true. Day 8 here, PowerPoint 7. We are looking at how to train your aerobic and your anaerobic energy systems. So we are basically looking at how, what's the difference when it comes to like training? What's the difference between cardio and strength, right? How do you develop type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers? So we kind of touched on this last night when we were looking at our different energy systems from NASM's chapter 4, right? We looked at like durations and how those durations are related, but today we're going to kind of go into that even a little bit more in depth. So we want to be able to understand like the principles of training as it relies to take a look at it. We're back. The principle of overload, the principle of specificity, the principle of individual differences, and then one extra one, which is the principle of reversibility. AKA, you need to be able to modify things if your client can't do something. I was running into that problem last night. Like I put together like a new chest workout last night, and I was like, I should be able to do like a giant set of these 3 things. And so it was like a superset of this plus that plus this. And by the time I got to my 3rd exercise, I was like, nope. Overestimated a little bit. And so I had to like take that down to like a modified version to make it a little bit easier. So we will talk a little bit about reversibility and how that, has like a relationship to inactive lifestyles and how it has like a relationship to, where you've been and where you are, and how those things kind of correspond. And then we'll talk about like energy transfer and things like that as well. The different training adaptations that you're going to get when it comes to like training aerobically or anaerobically, fast twitch muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers, and then the different adaptations to aerobic training, like developing, aerobic enzymes and things like that. So, we want to kind of be able to describe all that, the different factors that go into that. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about interval training today, which is always super, super fun. So, good God, is there another? No way is there 5 learning objective slides. There really is. Okay, sorry. The other thing that we're going to be going, man, dude, we're getting 1 slide per concept today. The difference between like running on a treadmill, steady state versus interval training. Yeah, of course. All right. So in order to prove athletic performance, in order to improve any of this stuff, we do know that we have to follow a few key specific rules here. One of which is we have to ensure that we are working at an intensity greater than our body is used to, right? That's that principle of overload. If your body has no reason to adapt, it won't. Your body's trying to be as efficient as possible, right? Like if, just like we're trying to be efficient in our everyday life, like why would you take a longer path to drive somewhere? You're going to take the most direct path possible, the shortest path, the one that burns the least amount of gas. That's exactly how your body works as well. Your body is constantly trying to be as efficient as possible. This is why a lot of people experience like plateaus, and so in order to experience like adaptation, we have to push ourselves beyond our capacity. We have to tell our body, hey, we have to send like sort of the signal to our body that's like, hey, we didn't succeed in this. We need to adapt in order to overcome this variable, right? And so we do know that like the most effective training is the type of training that pushes you outside of that zone. We also know that we want it to be very sport specific. You don't want to train for distance if your goal is to improve like speed, and you don't really want to train for like running downhill if your event is running uphill. Like there is like a direct correlation. We know that that's being very, very specific. And we also know that cardiovascular exercise is one of those types of exercise that supports everything that we do. Obviously we want to be specific, and bodybuilding is not exactly a cardio heavy sport, but we do know that like different types of cardiovascular exercise develop your body's ability to handle lactic acid in your bloodstream. And so if you can handle having more lactic acid in your bloodstream, you can sort of flood it while you're doing your cardio, and then kind of come back to that. That can actually enhance your ability to train for hypertrophy. That can actually make you better at dealing with that burn that's in your bloodstream, and help with even that nausea that we sometimes experience. So regular exercise can obviously help with all those things. So first thing we're going to kind of look at here, we're going to look at that principle of overload. So the principle of overload, like we stated, states that greater than normal stress, a principle that states greater than normal stress is required for training adaptation to take place, right? So the way I like to think about this, the way I like to kind of explain to my clients is like, if your body has no reason to adapt, then it won't, right? Like your body will not adapt to anything that it doesn't need to adapt to. You aren't going to get large muscles. You're not going to get strong by wanting it. You have to tell your body like, hey, we are not great at this. We need to get stronger if we're going to be good at this. And then that will create adaptation. So once your muscles have adapted, we need greater and greater levels of stress in order to continue that adaptation. So like your client, and by the way, adaptation is slow. Like we're seeing this right here. Adaptation is a very slow thing. It doesn't happen overnight, So your intensity might stay the same several weeks in a row, especially when you're training like your anaerobic system, except unless you're like a newbie. Like if it's like your first time ever doing like max strength training can go like a long way early on when you're like a newbie, just because your body, like, there's so much going on and your body's like, holy crap, this is all really new. We need to adapt, like, and so it has like, we call them newbie gains sometimes. That is something that you will sometimes see. Those people who have never exercised before, who start exercising, break all of the rules in the gym. They can gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. There's a lot that goes on there. But eventually your body starts to kind of slow down because it gets used to that adaptation, but like you might experience like strength gains really rapidly and hypertrophy gains really slowly, depending on like how your body is. And so your intensity might stay the same week per week, but that doesn't mean that you're not trying to push yourself. This is one of the reasons why, like, especially with strength and hypertrophy training, I like to give my clients a very small window of repetitions rather than just telling them exactly how many reps to do. Like I would like to say, like, especially when I'm doing like hypertrophy training, I really like to tell my clients to aim somewhere between 8 and 10 repetitions. If you can't hit 8, then it's too heavy. If you can hit 10, it's too light. So if you're hitting like 9 every time, but you're aiming for 10, or at least if you're aiming for 10 on the last set and you hit 9 in your final set, that's perfect. That's right at the intensity that I want you at. Next time we bring you into the gym, we're going to try that number again. And so let's say you're doing 3 sets. We'll say 12 to 15 reps. Let's say you're doing like a stabilization client, like brand new client, right? Give them a range of 12 to 15 repetitions. They're doing that 4-2-1 tempo. They're doing unstable exercise. They're doing all the stabilization rules. And like week 1, let's say it's a ball squat curl to press, right? And they get through, like you're writing in the drill, they do all 15 for set number 1. And then set number 2, they get to like 14 and then they just can't get that shoulder press again, right? They're just a little bit too tired in the arms. And so you write 14 in your workout journal, trying to do their final set. And they just like, oh yeah, try to get 15 on this one, and they get to like 13. That's perfect. Next week they come back, time to do that exercise again. They get 15 on the first set, they get 15 on the second set, they get 15 on the third set. Boom, they got their 3 sets of 15. That's perfect, right? Next week, we raise up the weight just a little bit, or we make it, since it's stabilization, we would make it more unstable. So we would probably use like a smaller ball, or maybe even put their feet on like an RX pad, find some way to like make that more challenging, right? And so now we make it harder, and suddenly that first set, let's say they get down to like, it makes it so hard that they can only do like 10 repetitions, right, on the first set. They just came back to the gym. They couldn't even do like the 12 on your first set. We went a little bit too intense. So we dial it back again, and we lower the intensity, because we're not trying to target 10 repetitions. We're trying to target a minimum of 12 repetitions. We want to be in that aerobic energy system because we're in the stabilization phase, right? So it's not always about just like making it harder and therefore like lowering your reps to nothing. We still want to be within our range, right? So what I would do is I would just revert back and be like, all right, we're going to hit 3 sets of 15 here over and over and over. And we're going to continue trying. It's like, you know, we go through 15, 15, 15. Next week they come back. Let's try that, you know, more intense version again. Sure enough, there it is. They hit 12, you know, and maybe they can only do 12 and then they're like 10 and 10, right? And it's like, okay, great. Like that was, you know, outside of that energy system at the end, but you were able to do it for the first set. And so we're trying to find like a blend somewhere within there. We might start the first set with that heavy weight, and then maybe we lower it down and try to have them target for 15, and we move the weights in between sets, you know, or we move the intensity in between sets. And that's a big part of like what we're doing here. We are trying to, you know, overload the body any way that we can. It can be weight, it can be level of stability, it could be tempo, it could be the number of repetitions, it could simply be limiting the rest period instead, although that's my least favorite one. You know, any of those are ways to like raise your intensity. That's my least favorite. That's my, that one's really good for cardio, but if you're trying to like strength gains, your rest periods should be pretty static. Like don't goof around with your rest periods too much. If strength is the goal. So when it comes to like that principle of overload, improvement is consistent with an increase in that stimulus, right? Like the more we increase that stimulus, the more your body is going to improve in response to it. So when we're looking at that, right? Progressive adaptations in, and this is both in like structure and function, right? Like your body will not only change itself to look a certain way, it obviously will also change itself and perform a certain way. Again, like going back to my favorite concept of function, of function following form, right? We know that like if you change how your body looks, now your body will perform a certain way, you know? If you lose a little bit of weight, if you get a little bit leaner, it's going to be easier for you to sprint because your body's going to be lighter, you know? But if you add a little bit of like, you know, if you develop larger muscles in your legs, which might make you heavier, well, that still could make you faster. It just depends on like what type of running you're doing. Maybe you have a better drive phase now during the beginning of your sprint. So obviously there's definitely going to be like a lot of different variables to consider, but no matter what we do know is that like your body's function is going to be related to how it looks and performs, you know, like the stress you give it will change your body, right? And so you want to give, if you are trying to change your body in a specific way, you need to give it specific types of stress. So we do know that like atrophy will occur if protein degradation exceeds protein synthesis. So remember, synthesizing means to make something, right? So if your body, you know, one thing that's kind of a dirty secret about like the gym that people don't realize is that you're not building muscle in the gym. You are breaking muscle in the gym. You know, you're building muscle in the kitchen. But like when you go to the gym, you are just there to damage the protein within your muscles, right? You're just there to like tear everything up. And so then like later when you eat food, your body will go, holy cow, everything got torn down. We need to build a stronger foundation. We need to make like a stronger, more damage resistant body. And that's how your body then develops, you know, new muscle and things like that to overcome that stress that you created. But if you are creating so much stress and you're not giving your body the nutrients it needs to repair or enough time to repair, protein breakdown is going to exceed protein buildup. So what might end up happening is you're experiencing atrophy. And atrophy is the exact opposite of hypertrophy, right? Hypertrophy is muscle growth. Atrophy is a decrease in muscle size. So that can happen. We can experience hypertrophy changes. So we'll look at, let's see here, physiologic response to overload. So our physiologic response to overload might be like hypertrophy. And then underneath this, right, the body experiences growth in response to tissue overload, right? And I'm going to put atrophy underneath here just because it is mentioned here. And so atrophy will be experienced if tissue breakdown exceeds tissue buildup, right? So if you are continually tearing your muscles down, this is where like obviously nutrition plays a key role, but also like atrophy can experience. This is where the bro split got so popular. You guys have heard me talk about the bro split before, where it's like you have a chest day, a shoulder day, a leg day. And the idea is that it's like, yeah, you work your muscle really hard once a week, give it a whole week to recover, right? That's plenty of time for your body to like finish adapting to that stress that you gave it last week. And that's not a bad thought. We are seeing more and more though that we don't quite need a whole week, and we find that in terms of like muscular growth and muscular strength, your body responds actually, if you can hit a muscle about twice per week with about 3 days of rest in between, that's actually pretty ideal. But if you were to hit it every single day, that might result in atrophy. That's a continual breakdown, so your body doesn't have time to repair. So you know, I would say the most ideal would be hit to muscle twice per week with 3 days of rest in between. Second best would probably be to hit a muscle once per week, and then try to avoid working the same muscles to failure every single day. That's too much. So that's a response. We also might see like neural control, right? So we might see like nervous system changes, such as an increase in motor units, right? That might be a physiologic response. Like if you continue to send like, hey, we're trying to lift heavy, but the brain is just not controlling these muscle fibers effectively. Well, your nervous system might make new neural pathways. And so you might get more motor units. And just as a quick review here, a motor unit is a single motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates, right? So remember, like your muscle fibers, those are individual muscle cells. So one neuron might zap 50 muscle cells, right? That's a really small unit, motor unit. It might zap 100 muscle cells. You know, that's a little bit larger. But the more motor units you have, the more muscle cells you're going to be able to contract simultaneously. So hypertrophy is a response, nervous system changes are a response, right? You also might experience increased stabilization due to enhanced proprioception. So your body might also, through like, you know, nervous system changes, it might also just get better at controlling those muscles and know how much force to recruit things. So you might enhance your proprioception. That's why balance training is so effective at enhancing proprioception, because like you're just giving it so much information every time you're standing on one leg. You're just wobbling the whole time. It's like, you know, if you were to like look at me wobbling like this, and then you slow that down with like a super high speed camera, my nervous system learned this position, this position, this position, this position. Well, it learned all of that. And so like all that information is coming in, so your brain gets better at it. So that's one of the responses we're going to experience to overload. So if we understand that, you know, these are some really basic responses to overload. By the way, one that's not in the PowerPoint here mentioned, but I'm just going to look at cardio changes, cardiovascular system changes, such as increased mitochondria. We might see hemoglobin and myoglobin levels, right? Those are all responses as well. Like your body will adapt however. So if we understand like that there's a bunch of different changes here, right? These aren't the only ones, but these are kind of three big ones. We know that we want to be as specific as possible to try to target whatever change it is that we are going for. And that's what leads us to the principle of specificity, right? That SAID principle. Right, which is going to be a training principle that states that the body will adapt specifically to the stress placed upon it, right? More commonly referred to as the SAID principle, right? So we do know that we need to like try to train very specifically for certain things, right? So if you're trying to get better at a specific skill, well, you should be doing that specific skill, you know, practice that. If you're trying to get better at juggling, weightlifting is not going to help you. You know, you want to make sure that you are doing the things that are directly related to your sport. And so that's where, you know, proper form comes from. This is why it's so freaking important to train with good form. And people don't put an emphasis on that. You know, people put an emphasis on finishing their set, you know, and I'm guilty of that. You know, like I get up in my head sometimes. Like the few times that I've like gone to a CrossFit gym, you know, CrossFit's all about like competition. And like, I tried to like keep a level head and be like, nope, I'm here to get a workout in. I'm not here to compete with that guy over there, you know? But sure enough, like, you know, you look at this workout and you're like, oh man, those are all the things that I'm already pretty good at. I've got a chance to crush this, you know, like, and sure enough, like you start to sacrifice your form a little bit. Because like you get kind of wrapped up in that. And this is part of the reason why, like, this is one of the problems that I have with CrossFit actually. That, and they are also an example of like the way they overload is they change stuff up constantly and it's way too much. But you know, that's where like training specifically becomes so important. If you do things with bad form continually, your nervous system learns that bad form and it gets better at that. It's like, hey, you got better at something that's close to a chest press. You didn't get better at the chest press, you know, like, and that's fine if it's its own exercise, but 9 out of 10 times it's not. It's just somebody trying to finish their set. So we need to make sure that we're performing specific skills or specific exercises in order to get better at that. And so proper execution is an adaptation, right? So proper execution of specific movement patterns is important because the body will adapt to that specific type of training, right? And so we're going to see sort of our subcategories here. We're going to see mechanical specificity, right? The weights and the movements, neuromuscular specificity, and metabolic specificity. I know a lot of people, maybe a couple of our new folks who are watching this video or haven't seen these terms yet, but these are going to come back later. But like, I'm just going to put a really brief version of each of these down. So we got mechanical specificity. This is one of the things you want to consider, right? Mechanical specificity is the weight and the movements. So heavy legs, right? The movement is for the legs. The weight that you are considering is heavy. You've got neuromuscular specificity, right? And that is going to be your the exercise selection and the tempo. Okay, so like exercise selection is like, are you going to choose to do a bench press or a push-up? Both are really good, right? I like both those exercises. A push-up is relatively unstable because you can lift one leg up off the ground and you're kind of stabilizing as you're moving through it. Whereas a bench press, you've got this nice stable bar, you're on a very solid bench, right? So one of those exercises is unstable, one of those exercises is stable. It's way easier to do heavy weights with stable exercises. So if your mechanical specificity that you were considering from earlier is that you want to get better at lifting heavy weights, well, then you probably want to do the bench press rather than a push-up. But if your goal from earlier was that you want to get better at like developing stability, well, then you probably want to do something like a push-up. And so neuromuscular specificity is another thing that you want to consider. Your exercise selection is like what type. Like you already said that you're going to do a chest exercise when you pick the movement. Well, now you need to pick what type of chest movement, right? And then the tempo is like, are you moving slow or are you moving fast? If you're trying to gain strength, fast works really great. If you're trying to gain size, medium tempo works really great. If you're trying to gain stability, slow tempos work really great. And then lastly, we've got metabolic specificity, which is really like, I can just never type this word. Specificity. Specificity. And so like your metabolic specificity is what energy system are you targeting? Are you trying to develop endurance? High repetition. Are you trying to develop strength? low repetition? Are you trying to gain size? Medium repetition, right? And so this is going to be the repetitions and rest period, right? Again, are you trying to develop endurance? Low rest. Are you trying to develop strength? Lots of rest. Are you trying to gain size? Medium rest. So those are kind of the three types of specificity that we have. And that's really what we consider when it comes down to our principle of specificity there. Aerobic, so here's an example, right? Aerobic athletes who engage in endurance training, they're the ones who are going to improve their type 1 fibers, right? So mechanically, they're going to pick low weight exercises. They're probably going to focus more on the legs just because there's more muscle in the legs. And so you're going to see aerobic athletes get really good at like leg exercises. Neuromuscularly, they're probably going to do relatively unstable exercises. So for their exercise selection, and their tempo is probably going to be relatively slow. So that they can develop that. Again, they're trying to develop type 1 fibers. They're trying to develop endurance. When it comes to their metabolic specificity, they're probably going to do a high number of repetitions, and their rest period is going to be relatively short, right? So all of that is going to help you develop more type 1 fibers. And so obviously that's the kind of stuff that's required for most like aerobic sports. Now, other things that we do need to consider, another one of our important training principles here is the principle of individual differences, right? And that's basically just saying that like everybody's different, and that's okay. So you need to make sure that you take into account somebody's age, their gender, their level of health, right? So it states that training for a sport should be based on your athlete's needs and whatever your client's goals are, right? So, my notes. So the principle of individual differences, right? And this is a training, a training principle that states that the training for a sport or activity should be based on the individual's needs. So basically, like, again, your goals should be really, like, your goals of writing a training program should be related to whatever it is your client wants. This is why you guys have heard me mention this statement before, like Maggie, Nancy, you guys probably remember this from our sports class. I've mentioned the principle of individual differences before, but I almost never put very much emphasis on it because it's, in my opinion, such a no-brainer. It's like, if you're being specific, you're gonna end up training for individual differences. Like, basically the whole, and like this principle just states like, hey, your clients should be setting their own goals. Yeah, duh, you know. But it does need to be stated in case somebody, you know, isn't considering it. And it is sometimes easy to forget. You know, sometimes you're like, oh, this will be a really fun thing that'll keep my client entertained. And it's like, well, entertained is good. Maybe that is one of your client's goals. That's why they're coming to the gym. But most of the time they're coming to, you know, experience a specific training adaptation. So as fun as that exercise may be, it's not directly related to your client's goal. And now your client's not going to meet their goal as quickly. And as entertaining as that exercise may have been for the day, the thing that your client will appreciate more is reaching their goal. You know, that's definitely something they care more about. And that's one thing to remember, because sometimes I get wrapped up in that too. I'm like, oh, this will be convenient. This will flow really well. And I was like, yeah, but I'm sacrificing efficiency, or I'm sacrificing efficacy for efficiency, right? I'm sacrificing effectiveness for, you know, speed. So it should be related to their age, their gender, their level of health, their progress, and then any other like previous experience that they have, right? So if the goal is to capitalize on someone's strength while working to overcome anything that they might be struggling with, right? So the goal is to capitalize on an individual's strengths while training to overcome any weaknesses, right? Like one thing that we know about like senior clients, for those of you who have been through like our senior programming class, is that like senior clients, when our body starts to make a shift from type 2 muscle fibers to type 1 muscle fibers as we get older. So because we know that they have like a predominance for type 1 muscle fibers, well, if we start stressing that type 1 system, we're likely able to see more gains in that system. So training for like a higher repetition with your senior clients has been shown to be very, very effective. So we're trying to take advantage of their metabolism. And this is where like sometimes like looking at body types, which I'm not a huge, I think the whole body type thing is kind of a pseudoscience a lot of times, because your body will adapt to whatever it is. But at the same time, obviously some people are just pre-programmed to be a little longer and leaner, and some people are a little more programmed to be a little more muscular, and some people tend to hold on to fat a little bit better. I think that being aware of those things is great, but like this can be the kind of thing that helps you know what to like take advantage of with that person and how to overcome it, and that's your principle of individual differences. Another one that we've got here, we're getting a bunch of training principles out of the way in the beginning, is the principle of reversibility. Reversibility. Okay, and that is basically going to state that adaptations are reversible if the person stops training. This is the bummer. This is the bummer principle, but it can be used for good. We're going to use it in a positive way when it comes to our training methods. But understanding the fact that like anything that can be gained can also be lost is an important thing when it comes to like strength training. I'm sure, all of us, I mean, I've only got two folks here, like Maggie and Nancy, I'm sure you've experienced this, because I know I have, like pandemic world, this new planet that we're living in, this alternate freaking reality has definitely like cost us in certain ways, like in terms of athleticism. Like I haven't played Ultimate in months, which is insane to me. And if you had like told my younger versions of myself that there was going to be a period of time where you don't go play Ultimate Frisbee for a few months, they'd be like, that's impossible. Who have you become, older me? And I'm sure when I get back out there, I'm going to be clunky and uncoordinated. I tried to throw a Frisbee to one of the dogs the other day, and I was like, good Lord, that feels weird, It's rough. And so like, that states that anything that can be gained can be lost. Well, the flip side of this is the fact that like anything that can be lost can also be regained, like luckily your body can tap right back into that. But understanding that is important to understand like why we want to try to maintain flexibility, strength, and endurance. Understanding the principle of reversibility is an important part of why we want to continue to train for flexibility, strength, and endurance, right? This is a big part of like why we want to train for these things, we do because they can be lost, that's one thing that my client, I remember I had a client one time, I had like a client who was so depressed one time, jokingly, but she's like, when are we done? When is this all over? You keep describing all these things that we're working towards. When is being sore over? When am I done training? And I'm like, you're never done. Like, there's just always something new to work on. And like, I remember like it washed over and she was like, oh, okay, let's go. She was like one of those, like one of my favorite types of clients. I think it's a really fun. I mean, my friend Chuck and I say this all the time, like complaining about stuff is super fun. Like, in a fun, if you're taking like a fun approach, like nobody likes that person who's constantly like whining or complaining, if they're serious, but like whining and complaining can be so fun sometimes, because it shows that like you're working hard, and so like she was like a really, really, really fun client. So anyway, aerobic and anaerobic changes, these are things that I will say, like your aerobic changes in particular, that is something that disappears quickly. Aerobic changes, because they are based on enzymes, and enzymes are a very short-lived protein inside of your body, that's something that can disappear really fast. But at the same time, it's something that can come back really quickly as well, as long as you start going back to that, principle of overload. So we want to basically avoid training at like an intensity that becomes like totally inactive. We want to avoid not training. So understanding reversibility is key there. Yeah, and here's the big one that we say here. So aside from neuromuscular skills, and that's the one thing, like ironically, muscle memory will maintain for quite some time. But your aerobic capacity, it disappears quick. So aside from neuromuscular skills, supporting your cardiorespiratory responses and numerous cellular responses in order to have a high aerobic capacity. All right, now there's a couple other ones here. Just a bunch of principles here. But this is where we're starting to get out of like direct training principles. There's the principle of progression, which really just goes right back. It just feeds into the principle of overload. There's nothing, the principle of progression doesn't need to exist on its own. But this is basically saying that gradual increases in your workload will result in increased muscular and cardiorespiratory performance, right? Again, if we understand our principle of overload, we understand the principle of progression, right? But what we do want to use is a term, so I guess I'll put that down here real quick, just so that we have it. Principle of progression is going to state that gradual increases in the workload will result in improvements in continued improvement in muscular and cardiorespiratory fitness without risk of injury. And this is what's kind of interesting. I will say there's one thing about the principle of overload that's actually, in my opinion, the thing that's most worth talking about. You are actually reducing your risk of injury by increasing intensity sometimes. Because we got to kind of look at the idea of like injury a little bit differently. A lot of times we think of injury as this like traumatic event that happens very suddenly, right? You're lifting a dumbbell, it goes the wrong way, tear something, and you're like, God, that hurts, right? We get hit by somebody, we get injured. We fall, we get injured, right? A lot of times we think of this like big traumatic event, but remember, like injury is just a decreased functional capacity of something. So what happens if you do the same exercise over and over and over again for years? Well, your body starts getting used to that posture. And now you've actually altered your posture. Your body's really good at moving one way and not so good at moving in any other way that's not related to that specific movement. In my opinion, that's an injury, If you're only good at one thing rather than being good at many things, that's decreasing your athletic status, And so this is another part of like, where progression comes in. Making a difference and progressing yourself from one exercise to another, to another, to another, it doesn't mean that you lose any of that stuff that you did previously, because now you're doing a more advanced version. That's still feeding backwards, and so that's a decreased risk for injury, actually. Sometimes progression is actually one of the best ways to ensure that you don't experience that. And so we do have a term for this. We're going to call it progressive overload. So this, like I said, this is where these two terms kind of like interlock, right? And that is going to describe that there is an optimal level of overload that should be achieved in a specific time frame in order for that overload to occur. So continued adaptation requires continued overload, right? There is an optimal level of overload to be achieved in an optimal time period. You're gonna experience plateaus, guys. Like it's gonna happen. Like everybody plateaus at some point. So when that happens, change it up, do something new, come back, revisit it. Suddenly you've busted through that plateau. This is where like I don't like. A lot of people love pyramid training because they've probably had new success on pyramid training. I think one thing that's like classic human psychology is that we're really good at noticing when something happens, and we're not so good at noticing when something stops happening. And so somebody might be like, oh, I started doing pyramid training and all my lifts went back up. And it's like, great, that's really awesome. Yeah, pyramid training had a really positive effect. But you've been doing pyramid training for like the last year. Are you still gaining the same way you were when you first started? Maybe it's time to go back to some linear training, go back to like straight sets, and then, use that pyramid training as like a plateau buster, I think it's like kind of a classic mistake that a lot of people make, actually. So this is where, yeah, that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about like the idea of progressive overload. You want to go through strength, endurance, hypertrophy, max strength, back to strength endurance, like if you're trying to see continued strength gains. Now, this is where they call it the principle of warm up and cool down. I'm going to not call it that, but we do want to talk about warming up and cooling down because they are very important things. So warm ups and cool downs. Both of these are very, very important. Actually, warm ups and cool downs. Okay, so a warm up. You've got two versions here, right? And this is going to state that a warm up should always precede intense exercise, right? The purpose of a warm up it will help prepare an athlete physiologically and, this is important, psychologically for exercise. I cannot say how important the psychological part is. It really, really is actually important. It gets you all of your good habits. And I know that we love to skip warm-ups. I'm looking at you guys, I'm looking at me, I'm looking at everybody watching this recording. Like, we all love to skip our warm-up. Like, we love to skip our cool down more. But everybody loves to skip those parts because they're like, no, I'm here to work on my strength. I'm here to get more athletic. It's like, but this is part of like that. This is, a lot of people don't approach their warm-up the same way they approach their strength training. But this is where, increased flexibility comes from, decreased risk of injury, all kinds of things. I know that like I train better. The number one thing that I skip, and this is going to sound funny because we always talk about how much I love running, but the number one thing I skip when it comes to my warm-up is just like my little 5 minutes of cardio. When I walk into the gym late and I'm just like, I'm going to go right into my stretches and then I'll get right into the strength training. I get into like all my like dynamic stretches and activation techniques and stuff like that. And sometimes I'll skip the cardio part. But whenever that happens, I notice a few things. I notice that I'm chattier in the gym. Like with my workout partner, I'll be like, hey, did you see that episode? And I start to chat more. I'm less focused. I'm lazier. I'm not really willing to push as much. Or sometimes I'll be just like really distracted. I'm like, oh man, I got to do this today or later. Like I got to make sure that I, work on this and get this taken care of at the house. Like I start to like go through all that stuff. But when I walk into the gym and like hit that treadmill for just 5 minutes, just a quick little run, that gives me a chance to psychologically like zone into like, hey, this building is for working out. We don't talk about fixing the front door in this like in this building, like this building is for this. We don't talk about work, we don't talk about bills, we talk about lifting weights, like that psychological warm-up is actually huge, especially for somebody like me who has a really bad temper when they drive. And somebody cuts me off, I will think about that person for the rest of my life. I'm like, oh, I don't know why they continue to drive like that. Like, oh, I hope they get a flat tire and I hope they're late for work and then I hope they lose their job and I hope they're homeless. Like, it's like, relax. That cardio warm-up melts all that away, or even just like the stretching part of that warm-up. Like that's my version of meditation sometimes, And so like, and talk to anybody who meditates, they'll tell you like, it gives you a chance to just be present and focus on the thing that you're working on. So do not understate the psychological benefits of a warm-up. Now, there are two types of warm-ups. There's a general warm-up, and it literally is in its name. What is a general warm-up? Well, it's a warm-up that's not specific to whatever it is you're doing, and really it's just trying to warm your body up. So it is warm up exercises or routines that are not specific to the exercise that is about to be performed. I like general warm-ups. For the most part, when we've done like these workshops in class and, you know, when I've led you guys through like warming up, those are usually non-specific warm-ups. Those are very general warm-ups. It's just like, hey, I want to get your blood flow increased. I want to get some increased oxygen delivery. And I want to make sure that every joint in your body is nice and hot so that like when we do something that's really explosive, there's plenty of room to move around and your muscles are very pliable. You know, that's really my main goal here. So these are like non-specific stretches, calisthenics, or cardio exercise. You know, me getting on like the treadmill for 5 minutes, that's a general warm up. You know, I'm not going for sprints during that workout. I'm going to go do some barbell squats. You know, running has nothing to do with that. Now, I'm not saying a general warm up is bad. I'm just saying it's not specific. And I know like we put a lot of emphasis on specific sometimes. So it makes it sound like general warm up should be skipped. General warm ups are great. This is where you can work on your overactive, underactive muscles, you know? No, like last night I was doing like a chest workout, right? But I still did like some stretches for like my sternocleidomastoid and my traps and my levator scapula. Like I worked on stuff that was above my chest, you know, just to get everything warmed up because, you know, I had a few more minutes and I wanted to like zone in, right? That's all very general and still very good for me, you know? But then we have specific warm-ups, and specific warm-ups are the ones that can sometimes have like those athletic benefits, right? So specific warm-ups are warm-up exercises or routines that are specific to the exercise that or sport that is about to be performed, you know? So examples of this might be doing like warm-up sets, for instance. That's a really good example. Warm-up sets, like if you're doing just the barbell for a bench press and then you rack it, throw a little bit of weight on, rack it, throw a little bit of weight on, rack it. You know, you might do 4 or 5 warm-up sets before you even do your maximum strength lifting, because that's giving your nervous system like a chance to get turned on. So warm-up sets, warm-up runs, doing things like high knees, which is directly related to like sprinting, or butt kickers, you know, things like that, or calisthenic exercises similar to the movements are about to be performed, right? Those are all really good examples of specific warm-ups. Now, I do want to address your cool down here, because it's so funny. The freaking textbook treats cool downs the same way we do. Like in sentence, they're like, don't skip your cool downs, and then they don't give it a paragraph. And it's like, so I do want to address cool downs here really quick. Your cool downs don't necessarily need to be crazy specific. In fact, if they are very similar to your general warm-ups, that's totally okay. So your cool down is an opportunity to return the body to a pre-exercise state. Okay, so this is where like stretches for muscles that you worked previously is a really good example, right? Like since I did a bunch of chest stuff last night, I definitely ended by doing a bunch of stretches for my chest because I don't want my chest, you know, I spent an entire time like shortening my chest muscles, right? It's like shorten, 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 rest. Okay, next set, shorten. You know, like I'm continually sending signals to these muscles to stay in this, you know, concentric shortened state. So I want to like eccentrically lengthen that stuff out afterwards by doing some stretches at the end. So that's one of the benefits of your cool downs. Now, going back to like a little bit of psychological stuff here as well, again, mentioning it also provides an emotional balance to exercise and a gentle transition back to rest. So one of the other big benefits here that we do not spend enough time talking about is the fact that like exercise is stressful. You know, your body doesn't know that those are dumbbells. Your body thinks that you're fighting off, you know, a pack of wild wolves, you know, like you're still a cave person, you know, like you're fighting saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths. Yeah, I know we weren't around the same, whatever. But like, you've seen Ice Age. So like, you know, we're, you know, your body doesn't know the difference there. So like providing yourself, it's like, hey, the battle is over, we can calm down, and your body can flush all those stress hormones out with like anti-stress hormones. That's one of the biggest benefits to a cool down. You know, people will talk about like feeling great leaving the gym. You'll get that much more often the more often you actually do your cool downs. So that's where you're just transitioning slowly out of a stressful state, and it signals your body like, hey, it's over. Let's make some dopamine. You've been making cortisol for the last hour. You've been making adrenaline for the last hour. Let's make some dopamine. Let's make some oxytocin. Let's make all those positive hormones, some serotonin, all that stuff that makes us feel good. There's a huge emotional balance that happens there. You want to get your clients to enjoy exercise more, which will get them to come to the gym more. Do your cool downs, or at least instruct them to do their cool downs. A lot of times, like, you know, this is one of the reasons why I like a personal touch at the end of my workouts. A lot of times when I'm warming people up, I will teach them their warm up in the first couple sessions, and then I'll hand that off to them. I'm like, here's what I want you to do every single time. Like, I'm going to be in the middle of my last session, but I'm going to look over at the stretching area, and I should see you over there doing this, and I teach them how to do that. If they don't need any like really hands-on assistance, I will usually pass that off to them. That way they're warmed up and I can spend more time working on all that strength stuff. And it gives me time at the end of the session to actually get my hands on them and stretch them out manually, which just feels great. Like it's a little bit of like almost like massage. And it's like, yeah, it's like, oh God, that's tight. But at the same time, it's like, oh, I feel so much better once that's all relieved. That personal touch that you're going to learn with Mo, all those stretches that we're going to teach you in Capstone, that stuff is so handy because it gives you a personal touch, which shows your client that you care about them. It gives more reasons like, well, yeah, I'm going to hire a trainer. I don't get to do this when like somebody else isn't stretching me out, you know, like, and again, it provides that emotional balance, which gives even more, reinforces the fact that there's something special about you, right? So that is some of the stuff we're going to teach you. And then one other thing, and this is going to sound surprising, but the cardio part of your cool down, that 5 minutes on the treadmill, will burn off any lactic acid and decrease the pain associated with that DOMS, that delayed onset muscle soreness. So one of the other benefits here is that cardio after a workout has been shown to decrease soreness. So I'm going to say this right now, and I want everybody to remember it. Stretching after your workout has not been shown to decrease soreness. I know that all of us, when we're sore, we'll go stretch something out and we're like, oh, that feels better. And you get 5 minutes of relief. 10 minutes, 5 minutes later, it's back to being really tight and you're really sore again. I know that stretching seems like it's the thing that decreases soreness. It is not. Soreness is caused in part by lactic acid sitting on your muscles. Lactic acid is fuel for your aerobic energy system, right? So by doing a little bit of cardio at the end of your workout, you will burn that lactic acid off as a fuel source. Again, you're going to get that emotional balance and you will decrease your client's soreness, improving their life. And then you won't get text messages from them that say, I can't get off the toilet and it's your fault, which by the way, you're going to get. Trust me on that. Cardio decreases soreness, not stretching. I know it seems surprising, but trust me on that. All right. So those are a whole bunch of principles. Last little bit we're going to see here, we're going to kind of go through some stuff that we've already talked about again. So let's talk really quickly about energy transfer. So we got to talk about like how we are able to, move from one energy system to another. So your athletes are able to meet the energy demands of their particular sport through a couple different things. There's neuromuscular changes, right? Your body is going to get better at a sport because it will develop muscle memory. Cardiovascular changes, your body will actually develop more enzymes and hemoglobin and things like that. And metabolic changes, your body will have more muscle fibers, which will require greater amounts of energy, but your body will be better at providing that energy, and it will actually be more efficient because it'll have more mitochondria or more cytoplasm or whatever it needs in order to be able to do that. And so this is why we are training for these main things. And this kind of looks similar to our specificities, right? Neuromuscular specificity, metabolic specificity, and mechanical specificity, which is kind of goes back to neuromuscular. But like we see, like these changes are very related to like how we, adapt to the body. And so exercise is going to rely on the continued production of that ATP. We need to train in our energy systems specifically. So there's kind of four main ways to produce ATP, right? You have got like creatine phosphate, which is basically any creatine that happens to be in the area. Adenylate kinase reactions, which is basically that creatine kinase donating, it's like using its enzyme to reattach that. Anaerobic glycolysis, which is that classic glycolysis that we talk about in the fluid portion of the cell, and aerobic metabolism, right? Which is where the pyruvates from glycolysis go to the mitochondria to be oxidized through the Krebs cycle. That produces a whole bunch of NAD and FAD, which then go through the electron transport chain. I know I've said it a million times. You guys are like, yeah, we get it at this point, but I don't know. It's the best way to memorize this stuff. So we just continue, saying it over and over and over again. So that final production, right? That final production is through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, right? Krebs cycle uses the byproducts of glycolysis. The electron transport chain uses the byproducts of the Krebs cycle. So that's how I like to think about it. Right, when I like to think about like energy transfer, right? Energy transfer. The way I kind of like to think about this stuff is like when you think about, glycolysis, right? Your product is, your ingredients rather, is glucose, right? And then your product that you get from that ingredient is ATP, and then your byproduct is pyruvate, right? And then that pyruvate will ferment into lactic acid, okay? So now, if we're looking at the Krebs cycle, right, your ingredients are going to be lactic acid and oxygen. Your product is going to be ATP, just like before, right? That's what we were trying to make. And then our byproduct is going to be CO2, and which your body's just going to exhale. You're going to get rid of that. You're going to get rid of CO2 and NAD plus FAD, right? So you're going to create like NAD and FAD. Then we've got our electron transport chain, right? And our ingredients are going to be NAD and FAD plus more oxygen, right? Our product is going to be ATP. And our byproduct is going to be CO2 and a little bit of water. A little bit of water and a little bit of CO2. And so like, I kind of like to lay things out like this. Like when I'm picturing this in my head, if I'm picturing like, the production line that is my metabolism, this is kind of how I like to think about it, right? You've got glucose, and that glucose goes through so many changes while it's going through metabolism. It becomes pyruvate, then it becomes lactic acid, then it becomes, NAD and FAD, and then eventually it becomes just a bunch of ATP until it's finally all broken down. And whatever's left is just like a little bit of water and a little bit of CO2, And that's kind of what's going in here. You've got ingredients, you've got products, and you've got byproducts. And byproducts are what go through a second step, or get exhaled by the body, get carried away. Byproducts are either discarded or they are recycled to be produced into something else, if we see that later on. And so that's kind of what we think of when we think of like energy transfer. And that's why like it's so important to remember that like you have this happening underneath these other two cycles constantly. So anaerobic adaptations to exercise, right? We're going to develop that in like non-endurance sports or like bodybuilders, right? So when we're looking at this, if we are training anaerobically, if we're making sure that like we start metabolism and then we stop before we get to the Krebs cycle, right? That is the type of person that we're training when we're training like an athlete or a bodybuilder, right? We're either developing like explosiveness or muscle mass. So your metabolic adaptations require overloading that energy system. And you need to do that by performing brief, near maximal intensity exercise, right? You need to work really, really hard and you need to work really, really short. And so that's going to, your athletes will get an increased capacity at dealing with lactate. I'll tell you, man, I'm pretty good at like dealing with lactate in the sense that my body burns lactate up for energy. My body's like, cool, lactic acid, Krebs cycle, activate. That's how my body is. But if I build too much lactate up, I start to get sick. Like I'm just not a hypertrophy person. Like my body, if I do get to a place where there's so much lactic acid, I'm gonna start to get ill if I continue to just stay in glycolysis, because that's just not the type of athlete I am. And I'm sure you guys have experienced that yourself, where you've been training and you're like, I'm good, I'm gonna throw up. Yep, that's gonna happen next. Like that is, you can get better at that. The more you train in that specific system, the better you will get at like dealing with that. I always get a little bit of that. I always get a little nauseous when I come back to things, when I come back to like hypertrophy training after like a few weeks. Schwarzenegger, he used to say if he didn't throw up on leg day, he didn't work hard enough. And it's like, oh God, you animal. But that is very much an anaerobic adaptation. That's why like you can still do cardio. You're just doing your cardio very anaerobically. You want to do intense cardio and then you want to rest. Intense cardio and then rest. That's what we're focusing on if your goal is to get better. I'll say it, I've said it before and I'll say it again, cardio will support you as a hypertrophy athlete. You will get better gains in the long run. Yeah, you burn too many calories during your cardio session, and that is a bummer. That took away from your gains for the day, but it made you better at that energy system. And now you're gonna be able to work harder in that energy system, in the future. So yeah, it broke today's workout, but tomorrow's workout's gonna be great. It's kind of like, I'm gonna say, you guys have seen the cow car. The cow car is ugly, but the money that I got when my insurance cut me a check that went into a bank account, which is now accruing interest, the next car that it buys will be lovely. So I stole that quote, by the way. That's actually yeah, totally, right? Absolutely. This is the type of, use it as motivation. Get better at cardio. Cardio makes your strength training better. I stole that quote, by the way. I stole that quote from Michael Caine, who was in Jaws 4, a terrible movie. And they asked him, they were like, Michael Caine, you're an Academy Award-winning actor. Why did you do Jaws 4? And he said, the movie is awful, but the home that it bought is lovely. So, all right, so there's some of our anaerobic adaptations. Anaerobic adaptations can be developed running or swimming. Particularly, though, the most common we're going to see is resistance training. What's important here is the duration, right? When you work at a high intensity for limited duration. So this is where interval training comprises the bulk of your anaerobic system. So if we're looking at cardio training for anaerobic athletes, right, we are going to anaerobic adaptations are developed using interval training systems, right? They could be running, swimming, or most commonly resistance training, right? So interval, basically what we want to focus on here is interval training should comprise the bulk of metabolic training, right? So we're focusing on stuff, primarily we are focusing on interval training. That's going to be the best one, okay? And so you're going to see like neurological changes there. You're going to see like metabolic changes there. Your body's going to adapt to that high intensity, okay? Now, if we're looking at aerobic training, you know, sort of the opposite, the flip side here, right? So cardio training for aerobic athletes, you know, we are primarily going to rely on the use of oxygen to produce ATP. So athletes will primarily rely on oxygen to produce ATP, right? So we're going to see a lot of adaptations will include cardiovascular adaptations, pulmonary adaptations, and metabolic adaptations, right? So cardiovascular system, your heart is going to have an increased stroke volume. You are going to be better, which will decrease your heart rate. You're going to see your blood vessels will get better at dilating and constricting. In the pulmonary system, your lungs will maybe develop more capillaries around your bronchioles and alveoli. And then metabolically, your body will produce more ATP. More mitochondria. Increased stroke volume at any given intensity there. So pulmonary adaptations include increased pulmonary ventilation during maximal and submaximal exercise, more enzymes to produce aerobic power, so fat and carbohydrate metabolism, and that does result in smaller muscles actually. That results in more efficient muscles that don't grow as large in size, and that's why we see type 1 muscle fibers be such a smaller, be so much smaller than like type 2 muscle fibers. So when we're looking at anaerobic training, right? So anaerobic muscular adaptation, anaerobic muscular adaptations, because anaerobic systems are a little more complex, there's sort of type 2A and type 2X here. When we're going to spend more time talking about this tomorrow, we're going to get into anaerobic training tomorrow. We will see, we are looking for like plyometrics or at least like heavy strength training, right? And so like athletes training for muscular adaptations will develop either type 2A muscle fibers or type 2X muscle fibers, right? And so like type 2X fibers benefit from plyometrics or other similar activities, right? So the more explosive you are training, the more you are training for those true fast twitch. But there's definitely like the thing about training for type 2 muscle fibers that sucks is that like it is a lot of times based on like how well your client is able to deal with that discomfort. Like when they're just like, this sucks, it burns, I'm sick, like all of that, right? Like, and so there are some emotional factors there. And this is where like, again, this is where I actually think that like the whole ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph thing, I think a lot of times it's less genetic and much more like, I mean, it is still genetic, but I think it's a lot of psychological, I enjoy cardio training. There's probably something in the back of my brain, like in my lizard brain, that is like addicted to long distance running. I came from a tribe of people that it's like, people showed up and they were like, we're going to fight. And my people were like, deuces, and ran off. Like, whereas somebody else who tends to be like a little more muscular might have been like, we're gonna fight, and they were like, let's do this, like, because I suck at running, so the only way I'm gonna survive is if I stick around, and use these big muscles. I think that a lot of times people like chalk it up to the metabolism. I think that it has a lot more to do with like the way that we are pre-programmed. It's like people who, you know, you will see like certain habits, you know, associated with like your genetics. And so, yeah, your genetics play a role, but if we believe that the body adapts to whatever stress we place upon it, we got to understand that like your body is also probably like, there's a reason Arnold Schwarzenegger found his way to the bodybuilding world. He was probably destined to do that because his brain was like, you know, the first time it's like somebody was like, here, try this dumbbell thing. And he was like, and his brain was like, I love that. Let's do more of that. And he got better and better and better at it, you know? So those are some of the factors, right? Some of the factors that affect your anaerobic training, factors that affect anaerobic training is athletes must be willing to deal with the discomforts of anaerobic training. Right? That is not a great sentence, but that is definitely a factor there. Now, another factor that is going to affect your aerobic training, we got to do the flip side, right? Aerobic training training adaptations, right? Athletes training for aerobic adaptations will develop type 1 muscle fibers, right? And so they are going to benefit from long duration exercise. So in order to do this, we also have to like, you know, kind of deal with like in the same way that we were just talking about like dealing with that discomfort. We got to make sure that this stuff is fun because chances are I'm got somebody out there watching this, or maybe one of you guys is listening to this and be like, yeah, but I hate cardio. It's so boring, right? Some people are like that. And that's okay. This is where our fit principles come back, right? And so like we have what are called our fit principles. Right? And by the way, I'm going to put E here in parentheses, just because that's, whoa, no. Was it the pound? FITTE principles, right? Which are training factors that are considered with aerobic training, right? So you've got frequency, intensity, time, type, and enjoyment. Enjoyment is NASM specific, by the way. You're not going to see that in this PowerPoint. But your intensity must be considered. Your duration needs to be considered. And so this is where we get into different work to rest ratios. And I'm going to work on these work to rest ratios with you guys later this week when we do our workshop. So that's actually pretty much all we got to get through today. The rest of this is actually extra. Do you guys have any questions? Oh, what the? Hold on 1 second, guys. I'll be right back. Hey. God dang it. Dog just threw up all over the floor. I could hear it. I was like, oh no. And I was not able to stop it. I will deal with that after this is over. Okay. So I do, well, all right, these work to rest ratios. I'm going to go over this really, really quick, but I will talk more about this, like how to structure your interval training in like on Friday when we talk about like training for cardio. But there are like work to rest ratios when it comes to setting up intervals, right? So if you are working for your immediate energy system, meaning you're working for that ATP system, you're going to use like a 1-to-3 work to rest ratio. So you're going to do 1 amounts of work and 3 amounts of rest. So maybe that's 20 seconds of work followed by 60 seconds of rest, right? That sprinting style is going to be using your ATP PC system. So if you're training for like type 2X muscle fibers, this is how you want to do your cardio. So you want your cardio to be really intense, really short, and then you want to take lots of rest. I would say a 1-to-5 ratio is even better. And so like 10 seconds of work, 50 seconds of rest, that's even better. Then you've got a 1-to-2 system. That's if you're training for glycolysis, basically you just want like twice as much rest as however much you're taking. So like training for glycolysis, type 2X muscle fibers, 20 seconds of work, 40 seconds of rest, right? Just double it. That's a really good way to get better at that system. So if you're training like zone 2, for instance, this is a great way to do that. And then a 1-to-1 ratio is going to work on your aerobic energy system. And that's where like, 1 minute on, 1 minute off. That's pretty long. So I'd say like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. That's even better. But honestly, like steady state cardio is a really good example of that as well. You don't even necessarily need to do intervals if you're training your aerobic system. So in the end, these factors that were going to affect your aerobics, right? Your genetics will play a major factor, like we've already talked about. The capacity to use oxygen is going to be a factor there, right? Aging is going to be a factor there. As we get older, we actually see a loss of skeletal muscle mass, but we see an increase in our fat metabolism, and we see an increase in our type 1 muscle fibers. And remember, type 1 muscle fibers, low intensity. Low intensity means long duration, which means most of your energy is coming from fat. So your body actually gets better at metabolizing fat as you get older. And that's kind of something that we're going to see there. So when you are prescribing intensity, like I said, you're going to see either use your heart rate or you are going to use a percentage of your VO2 max. But a lot of times you have to calculate your VO2 max. So the most common one we're going to use is your heart rate. 65 to 75% of your heart rate, 76 to 85% of your heart rate, 86 to 95. But we will look at those numbers when we get to cardio. Yeah, I mean, I've talked about a lot of stuff because I was like, we're going to talk about it later. Cool. No questions. How you feeling, Maggie? Pretty good? All right, guys. Well, that's about all I got for you. Let's go ahead and turn the old screen share off here. So tomorrow we're going to get into muscles. Then we're going to get back into cardio the day after that. And then we will hopefully get to the park and do a little bit of cardio. Anything else you guys need?
No. So far,
all right.
thank you.
I am going to go clean up a whole bunch of dog vomit. So
an exciting day today, huh?
Oh, it's going to be a blast. All right, guys. I will see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks so much. Bye.
I think,